Japan would love to convince the world that not only is Fukushima's danger a thing of the past, but that when it comes to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics, we should all come on down. But then someone who knows the country and the language spends 4 days in the company of Japanese activists to journey through the towns and radiation zones of Fukushima that take her within sight of the triple meltdown nuclear reactor remains. And she reports,
I came away with a strong feeling that the government is cynically rewriting the narrative and the geography of Fukushima in some really unwholesome ways. Doing things like erecting radiation monitors around town and cleaning up really well around the monitors to make readings come out lower. And well before the Olympics, Japan is using sports diplomacy to impart a veneer of safety to Fukushima. But the things that I saw on this trip struck me as more insidious and much more sinister.
Well, when you hear something like that from somebody who genuinely knows what's happening in Fukushima and speaks with the people who are there directly, you know that you and I and everyone else are sitting in a deadly seat that we all share.
Nuclear hot seat. What are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat. What have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat. The corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat. It's the bomb.
Welcome to Nuclear Hotseat, the weekly international news magazine keeping you up to date on all things nuclear from a different perspective. My name is Libby Halevi. I'm the producer and host, as well as a survivor of the nuclear accident at 3 Mile Island from just 1 mile away. So I know what can happen when those nuclear so-called experts get it wrong. This week, we take the first of 2 looks at the current state of Fukushima Prefecture 8.5 years after the nuclear triple meltdown. Beverly Findlay-Kaneko traveled through the prefecture for 4 days, going right to the edge of the evacuation zone, talking with activists and locals, finding out what the Japanese government is and is not doing with the contaminated lands that will host the first 3 days of the Olympic torch run, baseball, and women's softball games. This will not be a lot of tech talk, but a very human look at the ongoing devastation of Fukushima. We will also have nuclear news from around the world, numbnuts of the week for outstanding nuclear boneheadedness, and more honest nuclear information than has yet been discussed in the impeachment hearings. All of it coming up in just a few moments. Today is Tuesday, November 19, 2019, and here is the week's nuclear news from a different perspective. Starting off with my local nuclear nightmare, the Santa Susana Field Lab. There were 2 pieces that were run on KNBC Channel 4 on Friday, November 8th. We'll link to them on the website, that found that in the Santa Susana Field Lab stormwater runoff after the Woolsey fire in 2018, there were 57 instances of exceedances of the legal limit of toxins, including alpha radiation, as well as lead, dioxin, and cyanide. Professor Daniel Hirsch of the Committee to Close the Gap was quoted as saying that gross alpha radiation activity was 4 times the legal limit. Check it out on the website, nuclearhotseat.com, under this episode, number 439. In Illinois, uranium has been detected at the Maple Grove Elementary School near Metropolis, Illinois' Honeywell Uranium Conversion Facility. We'll have that video up on the website as well. In Boston, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has signed off and said A-OK to a request to exempt the now-closed Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station from certain emergency planning and preparedness requirements. U.S. Senator Edward Markey called it shocking and said he plans to introduce legislation in the U.S. Senate to correct this wrong. The industry just loves to ignore the decades of highly radioactive nuclear waste from the so-called spent fuel rods that are still on site and will be for the foreseeable future and beyond. In Montana, lame duck Governor Steve Bullock is pushing administrative rules to allow Montana landfills to accept radioactive waste from out-of-state fracking operations. In addition to groundwater contamination, radiation is a safety concern for landfill workers. For them, the risk of radiation increases if they inhale technologically enhanced radioactive material, dust, and lung cancer is a primary associated hazard. What could possibly be worth exposing Montana's citizens to the long-lasting and lethal effects of radioactive fracking waste? The answer? Profits, to be derived by a few landfill operators and some trucking companies and railroads that would ship the waste. No word yet on whether that windfall would also reach as far as Montana Governor Steve Bullock. And a holiday reminder that radioactive traces from the Fukushima nuclear disaster were found in California wine. This story from 2018 states that a group of French nuclear scientists tested 18 bottles of California's Rosé and Cabernet Sauvignon produced in 2009 and onward, and found that the wines produced after the disaster had increased levels of cesium-137. And a new report from the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons shows that nearly 50 U.S. universities are involved in the research and design of U.S. nuclear weapons. We will have a link up to that list on the website for this week's episode. Also, a link will be up to an article written by Edwin Lyman for the Bulletin of the Union of Concerned Scientists entitled Aging Nuclear Plants, Industry Cost Cutting, and Reduced Safety Oversight, a Dangerous Mix. Ya think? And one more link from a professional construction workers site on how construction workers employed at Department of Energy nuclear sites are at higher risk of cancer. Over to Japan, where inspectors have found dozens of cracks in facilities built to contain radiation at Japan's triple meltdown Fukushima nuclear facility. Tokyo-based publication Yomiuri Shimbun reported on Sunday, November 10, that 41 cracks were found in the plant's concrete floor, with inspectors having discovered weeds growing through the concrete. It says Tokyo Electric Power Company appears to have neglected the facilities and believes there's a danger that radioactive substances may have already seeped through the cracks and into the groundwater. While Japan is trying to justify dumping radioactive water from Fukushima Daiichi into the Pacific Ocean, according to Greenpeace International, the Japanese government's claim that it will run out of room to store radiation-contaminated water on site is simply not true. Sean Burney, senior nuclear specialist at Greenpeace Germany, who has conducted long-term surveys in Japan, reported that Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, the operators of Fukushima, said in a meeting in September that land is available to build additional storage tanks. Burney said the claim of insufficient capacity is just an excuse to cover the Japanese government's political agenda. Still thinking of going to the 2020 Radioactive Tokyo Olympics? Think again. Hotspots have been found in East Tokyo's Mizumoto Park. The soil of 12 out of 29 spots that were tested recorded more than 8,000 becquerels per kilogram of radioactive cesium, and the highest measurement was over 42,000 becquerels per kilogram. What does that mean? Before the Fukushima event, the maximum safe exposure, quote-unquote, was 1 becquerel per kilogram, changed to 20 after the disaster began. 8,000, 42,000. Just stay home and watch the competition on TV, if it actually takes place. Japan is pushing other countries to remove their barriers to food export from Fukushima. The latest to fall to international pressures is Singapore, which stated that it would remove its ban on food from Fukushima and adjacent prefectures affected by radiation from the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant disaster. But it will still require pre-export safety checks. Countries still very wisely retaining bans on certain goods from Japan will drop to 5: mainland China, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau. And South Korea has announced that chefs and food ingredients from that country will be traveling to the 2020 Tokyo Olympics next year to prepare food for South Koreans using homegrown ingredients for the duration of the Games. We will link on the website to an article on Fukushima workers battling leukemia and Japanese bureaucracy. In France, a powerful 5.4 earthquake hit central southern France on Monday, November 11, sparking fears over the possible damage of a nuclear power plant in the region. There are 3 nuclear reactors to check from the Croix-Mayes, pardon the pronunciation, nuclear plant. We'll also link to a new report that decries unresolved and incalculable risks of radioactive waste. This from Beyond Nuclear International. And now...
Nuclear hot seat, nuclear hot seat, nuclear hot seat, nuts of the week.
In the South Pacific, the United States has demanded a cleanup of the Runit Dome. That's where the U.S. dumped 35 Olympic swimming pools worth of atomic soil and debris that it created in its Cold War nuclear weapons testing program. But no, they were not demanding a cleanup of the radioactive waste, something the Marshall Islanders have been requesting for years. They wanted a cleanup of the anti-U.S. graffiti that had been spray-painted to the top of the dome. And despite its position that the dome and its radioactive contents actually belonged to the Marshallese government, despite the fact that it was all created by the U.S., our Department of Energy paid a contractor to scrub off the offending message after getting permission from the mayor of Inuiatok Atoll, where the dome is located. While Inuiatok Mayor Jack Ading said he probably should have rejected the request to remove it because the message on the dome reflected Marshallese sentiment that the U.S. should take ownership of the radioactive waste, he said, "I did not want to fight the U.S. government over a graffiti." As reported in a recent LA Times special supplement on the Marshall Islands, some find it ironic that the Energy Department and its contractors are keeping the surface of the dome clean while doing nothing to prevent the radioactive waste from leaking out of it. And that's why DOE and your short-sighted, misplaced concern about appearances of the Runit Dome and not the substance of it, you are this week's
Nuclear hot seat, nuts of the week.
By the way, we will have a link up to that LA Times 12-page special supplement, which is available online. It was written and spearheaded by reporter Suzanne Rust. We'll have this week's featured interview in just a moment, but first, is it too late to mention the H word? Holidays? Probably, and I don't blame you. That means I definitely won't use the fa-la-la-la-la C word, but I will mention the T word, Thanksgiving, and how grateful I am for the support you, the listeners, have given to Nuclear Hot Seat through the years. Right now, our exciting news is that we're just about to start the website revamp, the goal being easier searchability, a great new look, and the capacity to keep uploading new episodes until the nuclear problem is solved, or we reach the half-life of plutonium, whichever comes first. It's an important step for the show, and one that has been a long time coming. The problem? Same as always. It's going to cost a chunk of change. Now, some of you have already provided financial support earmarked to go towards the new website, for which I am grateful, because that's what's allowing me to start the process. But we've still got a long way to go. And we'll need the help of a lot more of you to get this new website beauty up and running. So if you're grateful for the kind of verifiable nuclear news you get here every week, how about letting us know with a donation? Any size helps, be it a one-time donation in advance of America's Turkey Day or a monthly sustaining donation. It all helps to keep honest, verifiable nuclear information flowing out to you, the listener. It's easy to help. Just go to nuclearhotseat.com and click on the big red donate button. Know that your generosity at this time, at whatever level you can afford, is helping to combat the nuclear menace in all of its forms with solid, footnoted, reliably sourced information. That makes me deeply grateful that you are listening and that you care. Here's this week's featured interview. This week, we are up close and personal with Fukushima. Beverly Findlay-Kaneko lived in Yokohama, Japan for 20 years until March of 2011, after the Great Eastern Japan earthquake. Previously, she worked at Yokohama National University and the Japan Times. Beverly has a master's degree in East Asian Studies from Stanford University and speaks Japanese fluently. Since returning from Japan, Beverly and her husband, Yuji Kaneko, have been active in raising awareness about nuclear issues, including the nuclear accident at Fukushima. Their main activities have included organizing speaking tours, giving presentations, networking in activist and nuclear-impacted communities in the U.S. and Japan, and co-producing the annual Nuclear Hotseat Voices from Japan special for the Fukushima anniversary. Recently, Beverly and Yuji spent 4 days on the ground in Fukushima Prefecture with local activists to find out what life is like for those who are still trying to live there, as well as those who will never return. This is not a technical report, but an eyewitness recounting of the human factor, what the world's worst nuclear accident has done to the people and the land. In this first of 2 parts, Beverly moves us progressively closer to Fukushima Daiichi through the Japanese towns of Koriyama, Miharu, and Kawachi Village. Beverly Findlay-Kaneko, always terrific when we get to work together on Nuclear Hotseat.
Yes, I'm really happy to be working with you again, too.
You recently came back from an extended trip in Japan, and part of that was to spend 4 days going to Fukushima and through many of the towns in the prefecture. And I'd like you to take us on that journey with you so that we can understand some of the things that you discovered by being on the ground there and seeing things that the rest of us can't. Start out first, though, I think this is important, to let people have an idea as to what the geography of Fukushima is like.
Well, the geography of Fukushima is actually split into 3 different areas. Outside of Japan, and even outside of Fukushima in Japan, it seems like the name of the nuclear power plant and the accident have become synonymous with the entire prefecture. And it's actually a really big place, and much of it was not severely impacted by the accident. Fukushima people divide their prefecture into 3 areas: Hamadori, Nakadori, and Aizu. On this trip, we were able to travel through all 3 of the areas. Hama means seaside, so Hamadori is the area along the coast, and that was the area that was most affected by the nuclear accident. It encompasses Futaba, where the Fukushima Daiichi plant is, along with many of the towns that were wiped out by the tsunami. Naka means middle, and Nakadori is the middle of the prefecture. It includes the 2 major cities in the prefecture, Fukushima City and Koriyama. It's where the bullet train, which is a major transportation artery from north and south, it cuts through Nakadori. And it was contaminated to a lesser degree than the Hamadori area or the coastal area, but a few of the places were in the direct path of the plume. Many people actually left the area as voluntary evacuees because they were skeptical about the high emergency levels of exposure being allowed by the government. There was some token initial help with rent for those people in the Naka or middle area, but that was cut off fairly quickly. You probably remember a couple years ago, we talked to Noriko Matsumoto on a Voices from Japan episode. Due to the stigma and the meager compensation offered to these people, most people in Nakadori chose to stay in their homes while the government went about the messy business of decontamination. Decontamination isn't really as straightforward as the government would have you believe. So we have a couple of examples of that. Hida-san, Shinshu Hida, who we were traveling on this trip, lives in Miharu, which is along the eastern edge of Nakadori. And he told us how frustrated he was when they were decontaminating his car. They kept getting high readings from around the rubber seal around the windshield, and they wouldn't tell him what the reading was. And so they would clean it again, and they get a high reading again. And they went through this process 5 times. And he kept saying, well, what is the reading? And they said, we can't tell you, it's the rules. Another friend in Fukushima City had trouble with the decontamination of the drainage channel in back of his house. And also, he was a school principal, and it was a really long time, years, in fact, before the rain gutters at the school he was in charge of, the levels actually came down. So it's a pretty involved process. Finally, to the west is Aizu, and Aizu is a huge flat basin that's covered in rice fields and surrounded by mountains. And while we were visiting, it was almost harvest season. All of the rice fields were shimmering in gold. It was so beautiful. This area was spared most of the plume, and it was much less contaminated.
Where did you travel, and who were your traveling companions? Because I think that's important in terms of your perspective.
We traveled together with Shinshu Hida and Setsuko Kida, who have both been on our Nuclear Hotseat Voices from Japan updates more than once. The first part of our trip focused primarily on the areas that are directly adjacent to the present difficult to return zone. These areas had been part of the exclusion zone until March 2017 and had either been inaccessible or only open to short visits without any overnight stays, and only for actual property owners in the area. I used 2 different terms there. One was difficult to return and the other one was exclusion. Those I'm going to use interchangeably. Difficult to return is a direct translation from the Japanese, which is Kikan Konnan Kuiki, and it's what's used in the official translations in Japan. These areas are now completely open to the public. We visited Tomioka, where Setsuko Kida used to live, Namie, and Kawauchi Village. So those are all places that used to be in the exclusion zone. We also drove through the present difficult to return zone, passing through Okuma and Futaba. This is open to vehicle traffic only, and you have to keep your windows up during traveling through that area.
That's because of the radiation level still?
Exactly. I'll talk about that more in detail later. We also stayed overnight in Koriyama. It was never evacuated, and it acted as a host and temporary housing location for evacuees. Many people left Koriyama as voluntary evacuees due to the radioactive contamination. We visited Miharu town, where Shinshu Hida lives, and it's east of Koriyama, a little bit closer to Fukushima Daiichi. We ended our journey in Aizu to visit former Nuclear Hotseat guest, thyroid cancer victim advocate Chikako Chiba, to get an update on the thyroid cancer situation in Fukushima.
What general impressions did you have coming out of this trip?
I came away with a strong feeling that the government is cynically rewriting the narrative and the geography of Fukushima in some really unwholesome ways. Of course, we all know how they've tried to trivialize some of the effects of the accident, doing things like erecting radiation monitors around town and cleaning up really well around the monitors to make readings come out lower. But the things that I saw on this trip struck me as more insidious and much more sinister. The word that kept coming to my mind was desaparecidos, as in the disappeared in Latin America. Those people that suffered a fate that's worse than death, those executions that were carried out by the military and paramilitary groups, and that were intended to sow uncertainty, leaving no bodies, no evidence, and no explanations. The final intended result is no accountability, whether it be Latin American death squads or the Japanese government, TEPCO, and the global nuclear industry.
You started out at Koriyama. How did you travel there, and what was it like when you got there?
We took the bullet train from Tokyo to Koriyama, and Koriyama is about 44 miles from Fukushima Daiichi. It's bigger than the one at Fukushima City, where I visited in 2015. And the city seems a little more built up with big buildings and industry. When we got out front of the station, there was a radiation monitor in the middle of the brick-paved plaza, again, away from any vegetation. And it read 0.125 microsieverts per hour. That's not really very high, but it's more than twice what we get in our garden in Yokohama. Unfortunately, parts of Koriyama were severely flooded during the recent typhoon Hagibis, and that was after we visited. And watching TV and seeing those roads that we had just traveled on being completely overtaken by the rising waters was horrifying. And thinking about all the radiation, that settled at the bottom of those streams and rivers being churned up and rushing through the town. So I would believe that in some areas it's going to be over 0.125 microsieverts per hour just after the typhoon. I'd be curious about that.
We've just learned that the same group that did the testing, the 4,000 people who did the testing for the Citizens Radiation Map of Japan, are now going to be open to testing the mud and the resulting dust after Hagibis to see if there has been any change. And as we get any results on that, we'll be reporting it on the show.
That's really important, and I really admire their effort putting together all of the different citizen scientists' work. It's really crucial, and it's a very ongoing documentation about what's been happening over the years in terms of Fukushima Daiichi. So we got to the station there, and we walked a couple blocks to the hotel. It was a Monday afternoon, and I was a little bit surprised about how quiet it was. And there were several business fronts there that were shuttered. I don't know whether this was general economic downturn or post-accident downturn, but it seemed very quiet. All of the restaurants and cafes were closed. And for the 2 nights that we were there, everything in the neighborhood, all the bars and the restaurants and things were so quiet. It's as if the sidewalks were just rolled up after dark, which seems so strange. There was a group of what looked like Russian soccer or rugby players staying at the hotel. And that made me really curious. So I started to do a little snooping around, knowing that J Village Stadium and soccer training facility over in Naraha had reopened in April this year in preparation for the Olympics. Naraha is just 12 and a half miles from Fukushima Daiichi, and it's actually where the Tokyo Olympic torch relay is slated to begin. It was in the exclusion zone until 2015, when officials deemed it was safe to return. And from poking around online, I found that J Village is heavily promoting itself as an international training facility for soccer camps. Did you know that it's even on TripAdvisor and you can go stay there? Yeah.
Oh, what fun!
One of the websites that I looked at listed area hotels. If you were going to go do a training camp at J Village, what area hotels to use. And our hotel was on it, despite being 40 miles away from the site. And I found out also that before the Rugby World Cup, which is actually ongoing right now, it started September 20th and goes through November 2nd, and it's all across Japan. The Argentinian team used J Village as their training camp. So it's already being used. I'm not really sure where the Russians were practicing or playing, or if they were soccer players or rugby players. But I also discovered that there's a soccer training facility in Koriyama that hosts international teams. So really, well before the Olympics, Japan is using sports diplomacy to impart a veneer of safety to Fukushima.
Let's move on to Miharu and what you experienced there.
Shortly after we got there, Hida-san came to pick us up at the hotel, and we headed out to Miharu, which is several miles east of Koriyama in the direction of Fukushima Daiichi. Hida-san has been photographing the aftermath of the accident and the earthquake and the tsunami for the past 8 years. He's taken over 7,000 photos, and he's done over 300 exhibitions of his photographs all around Japan and in a few different countries. He's been one of our main contacts, and he's appeared on a few of the episodes for Nuclear Hotseat. His passion and anger about the situation hasn't subsided one bit over the years, despite the fact that he hasn't been in very great health lately. Along with the depth of firsthand knowledge and experience, he, on that day, was armed with some really heavy-duty camera equipment and an academic-grade radiation monitor that was connected with a professor in Tokyo. So everywhere we went was being charted and is probably somehow involved in that citizens' radiation project that you talked about a couple weeks ago. The first thing they talked about was the acquittal of the TEPCO executives recently. Hida-san disgustedly dismissed the judge's decision as a farce and saying that the Abe administration, via the chief cabinet secretary, ordered an acquittal. He felt that the reasoning was nonsense, and I think many of us agree with him. One thing that Hida-san wanted to get off his chest quickly and kept circling back to was his feeling that certain areas in the difficult to return zone, as well as surrounding areas, will eventually be erased from the map of Japan. They will be disappeared.
What do you mean by that?
Many of these towns and villages are already being used for temporary and interim storage of various levels of nuclear decontamination waste. And there are incineration sites for that contaminated waste. Some areas, such as Tomioka, where Setsuko Kida used to live, will become home to permanent storage sites for contaminated materials. A lot of money has been spent to get these towns up and running again, but from what we were to see over the next few days, most of the money is going straight down the drain, if population is a measure. As an example, Hida-san mentioned the town of Okuma, which is right now is half in and half out the difficult to return zone. He said that the town has built a new city hall with money from the government reconstruction agency, and it cost $29 million. $29 million, and only 100 people have returned to Okuma to live. I did a quick thing on my phone calculator, and that was like $350,000 per person for that city hall. And that's not the only investment.
And yet they claim to not have the money to subsidize the housing of the people who were displaced by the tsunami, by the earthquake, and most unfortunately, by the nuclear accident in Fukushima Daiichi.
Yeah, unfortunately, that money would be put toward bad advertising in their eyes. The fancy new city hall is a better advertising investment for them. Most of the original residents that have returned there are elderly people, and young people are not returning. For now, property tax exclusions on their empty homes and idle farms apply. So they are not paying property tax. But homes in the recently reopened areas have a 3/4 reduction. So they are only paying 1/4 of their property tax. And this is whether they've moved back or not. This will be cut to half by next year. And then full tax will probably be reinstated within 3 years.
So these are incentives made to make people want to move back there?
It's a disincentive to stay away. If you stay away, you're going to be paying property tax on the place you've moved to, and you're going to be paying tax on your property in Fukushima, paying double tax. Hida-san thinks that many younger people will not be willing to pay this double tax on their post-disaster home and their Fukushima property. And they'll eventually be squeezed out and forced to abandon or sell their Fukushima property to the government or some related entity. This will allow the government to possibly use the land for more toxic forms of waste. The government is in it for the long game. I think they're throwing money at the problem now for PR purposes, but the reality is that many of these places will slowly wither and cease to exist, perhaps allowing the government to use the land for other purposes. Hida-san primed us about what we're going to see for the next day when we would be driving through the villages on the edge of the difficult to return zone. He told us that every day, 2,200 trucks bringing loads of contaminated soil from temporary sites around the prefecture, like the site in Tamura where the bags were washed away in Typhoon Hagibis, to the interim sites in the coastal villages to await incineration or other treatment. As we wove our way along the narrow, curving, hilly road to Miharu, Hida-san explained that many of the truck drivers trucking this contaminated waste are not from Fukushima. And the drivers are not used to Fukushima's winding roads, and there are often accidents involving those trucks bearing toxic debris. Some of the drivers drink and drive. I don't blame them because their job must be very stressful and very depressing. They have to pass through the difficult to return zone to get to the interim sites where the radiation levels are very, very high. Hida-san said that there have been 3 big accidents recently in the zone, and that one driver was stuck for 4 hours waiting for help, being exposed to high radiation levels the whole time.
Do we know if the trucks themselves that are carrying the waste are sealed? Do they have tarps over them? Or is perhaps the so-called decontaminated material available to be spread further because of dust or the truck going over bumps and things getting dispersed and falling off the back of it?
Well, there are a couple different kinds of trucks that I've seen personally. When I was in the prefecture a few years ago, they were smaller trucks taking those big bags from people's homes and then carting them to, say, an abandoned rice paddy field for a temporary storage. And then those were carted by medium-sized trucks to a little bit bigger temporary storage. The trucks that we saw mostly on this trip were big flatbed trucks. They weren't really that secured as far as I could tell. They had some kind of a tarp over them, but it wasn't completely closed off. And a lot of the trucks looked kind of grubby and dusty. How can you help it? They're going into these areas and, they're dealing with carting mud and dirt, and when it dries, it gets dusty. So I think definitely they're spreading contamination in their wake. Absolutely.
I know you had some observations, or Hida-san did, about the wildlife in the area.
A few years ago, when they were visiting Kida-san's house, they came upon an inobuta, which is a wild boar domestic pig hybrid. And those guys get huge, like 300 pounds. And they charge around everywhere and rip things up and get into people's houses. And they also like to multiply. So it's a big issue for the people that live around there because they just cause so much destruction and trouble. Each different municipality has a different way of dealing with those radioactive animals. And some of them just flat out incinerate them. Some of them bury them. Miharu freezes them and then chops them up and incinerates the pieces. And Hida-san also said that, Japan is really noisy with insects in the summer, buzzing, and there's cicadas and crickets, and it's a noisy place. He said that this year it was really, really quiet. He thinks the insect population has really declined. He said, unfortunately, there's still lots of mosquitoes. He also mentioned there was a professor at Okinawa University that had been studying the effects of the accident on the insect population, and that his government research funding was cut. So they're discouraging him. That reminds me of Timothy Mousseau, who said that he has a really hard time getting grants and things for his work. And finally, he mentioned that recently some monkey poop with 13,000 becquerels of cesium was found.
One can't imagine what they ate or how much of it and how badly contaminated it was to show up at that high level in that form.
Well, monkeys really like fruit and things that are grown on farms.
It might even be organic, but that doesn't mean that it's free of radiation. And obviously,
Exactly.
It was not.
We drove under a really long canopy of cherry trees, which were not in bloom, but I could tell that it would be beautiful in the springtime. I mentioned that to Hida-san, and he said, it is beautiful, but the year of the accident, I couldn't photograph them. I was just too sad and too depressed. And then I asked him about the famous Cherry Blossom Road in Tomioka, where Kida-san lived. And he said that he was only able to go back there and photograph those trees 3 years after the accident. And he said he sobbed the entire time. Miharu is really a beautiful town. There are bridges and there are streams and magical cherry trees that attract tourists from all over. It's also 80% forested hills that have never been decontaminated. It was never evacuated. Hida-san said that 80% of the people have returned. And after all these years, his disgust with what TEPCO and the Japanese government have done to his home is palpable. And his sadness is what keeps him going. Miharu was the very first place that had temporary housing for evacuees. It was very strict, and those who had wanted to get in had to have proof of residence. And from the beginning, Hida-san was a volunteer to help with the evacuees. And that's why he has so many photos from the very beginning of what happened. He told us that he's tired about talking about 3.11 or 3/11 and the whole nuclear thing. He feels that the real issue now is what to do about the people who are still living in Fukushima's contaminated areas, all of the aged people dying in loneliness.
On the second day of your trip, you were able to join up with Setsuko Kida, who has also been on Nuclear Hotseat several times. Tell us about what it was like to head towards the difficult-to-return zone and the adjacent villages.
Once Kida-san arrived, we got into her SUV and headed west to the difficult-to-return zone. Ideally, we would have taken Route 288, which is a direct route. What I understand, it's more of a highway that connects Koriyama and Futaba, where Fukushima Daiichi is. But we opted to take a smaller winding road because 288 is always jammed with trucks carting debris, and there are lots and lots of accidents. As we went along those winding roads, there were more and more paddy fields, rice paddy fields. And before the accident, each village in the area had a separate agricultural co-op, which in Japanese is known as Nokyo or JA. There was a JA Koriyama, a JA Futaba, a JA Iwaki, and so on. After the accident, farmers had trouble selling their products under those names because they were synonymous with radioactive contamination. So the area JAs ceased to exist, at least in their name. They were disappeared, but they were regrouped under a new brand called JA Sakura or JA Cherry Blossom. Most of that JA Sakura rice is not sold on the general market, but it probably is used in processed foods like rice crackers. So you just don't know when you buy rice crackers or something like that in Japan where exactly the ingredients are from. It'll say something like Kokusan, domestic rice, but that could mean it's from those areas in Fukushima. Rebranding is a typical Japanese way of dealing with a negative image. We passed through the town of Tamura, where in a few weeks after our trip, bags of contaminated soil were washed into a nearby stream by Typhoon Hagibis flooding. I snapped a picture of a golden paddy field with a huge lumpy pile of those black bags that were haphazardly covered with a blue tarp in the background. There was a new uncovered pile of bags that was started next to the covered bags, and there were a few other bags that were perched on top of the blue pile for good measure. Nearby, sticking out of the paddy field, were a couple of signs. One was a yellow banner, and the other one was a hand-painted sign, and they were protesting biomass energy production. That's a method the government has considered to get rid of contaminated waste and forest products and use up funds provided by the Reconstruction Agency. The signs read, "Absolutely opposed to the construction of biomass energy facility. Don't pollute Tamura City with any more radiation." And the other read, "Protect our children from radiation."
So the people have a voice, even if it is a small hand-painted one. But to think of it in the middle of a field with all of that contamination is heartbreaking and poetic at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
With this trip, it sounds like you are getting progressively closer to
Exactly.
Fukushima Daiichi.
Uh-huh.
What was it like the closer you got?
As we got closer to Fukushima Daiichi and approached our first stop, which was Kawauchi Village, I noticed that there were a few weed-choked fields here and there that were not being cultivated. Hida-san said that in 10 years, he expects that most of those fields will look like this as the older generation passes away. The government is just waiting for the elders to die and the younger people to give up. 80% of the original Kawauchi village residents have not returned, despite the mayor's slogan anointing Kawauchi as the reconstruction frontrunner in the first year after the accident. Only the old and poor returned because compensation was cut after just 1 year.
They build a new city hall, but they don't have compensation for the victims.
Right. We were there to deliver freshly milled rice donated from other areas in Japan to Shida-san, a town council member. He periodically runs a market called Showa no Ichiba to distribute various donated goods to residents. We then followed Shida-san to the brand new Yotashi shopping center. It's a family mart, but it's like a 7-Eleven with a few extra services. And if you look at the customers, they appeared to be people from outside the village, like men wearing work uniforms. They were all looking grubby and tired. Shida-san told us that the original villagers are mostly senior citizens, and they don't have even enough money to shop at the convenience store. It's too much of a luxury for them, which is why we were donating rice. The parking lot is filled with trucks coming in and out and going to various decontamination and reconstruction sites in the area. Fukushima Daiichi was a great thing for them because it lifted the village out of poverty, it gave people work, and fostered all sorts of related businesses to the nuclear power plant. The men could stay home again, and as the village's deep-pocketed benefactor, TEPCO was known as the honorific Toden-sama. It was like, our Lord, TEPCO.
Yeah, a lot of people look at TEPCO and go, my God! But I think they mean something different.
Yes, probably. Shida-san says now, as far as like an economic era, he sees the present time as the Fukko bubble, or the reconstruction bubble, as in bubble economy. A lot of money is flowing to the villages and towns like Kawauchi, Okuma, Futaba, and Tomioka. And the city councilors have the job of coming up with ways to use it. He understands that the money is temporary, And he's really finding it a challenge to use the money in a way that'll help residents. He worries that Kawauchi will become a dekasegi town again.
Meaning one that is economically depressed.
Yeah, economically depressed, and where people, if they want to live there, they have to go somewhere else far away to work. So they've started various new businesses. He told us about an exit sign company that was started with a $27 million investment from the central government.
That's a lot of signs.
Yeah. Aquaculture farms, a wetsuit company with a $5.6 million investment, and then plans to grow wine grapes and start a winery. There's the idea that grapes don't take up cesium as much as some of other produce. So that's one of the ideas that they have. All of these businesses are having real trouble employing people. For regular jobs, for each employable worker, there are 8 jobs available. So if you need work, that's where you need to go. For caregivers, which is important for the large population of old people, there are 20 jobs available for each job seeker. So most of the workers come from outside the village, and the wetsuit company employs young women from Vietnam. So this is also another challenge for the village, because educating the children that those Vietnamese women bring along with them is something else that they have to think about. It's something that costs more money.
And it also puts the children at risk from the radiation.
Exactly. I'm not talking a whole lot about radiation in this, and I feel bad about it, but I kind of feel like it's just a given about the whole thing. Shida-san's wish is that the prefectural and national governments would do more to help rebuild the town, but he stresses the need for local input. But he says that local opinions are ignored while the money is doled out. So there's not really much local input. Kawauchi ties for number 1 in depopulation, along with Onagawa, which is another little mountain hamlet. Shida-san told us that there used to be 210 children in the village, and now there are only 100. He said that 70% in the new reconstruction housing are not even from Fukushima Prefecture. They're mostly people connected with the decontamination reconstruction businesses. 42% of the 631 villagers are 75 years old and older. And among those, probably around 10 of them are over 100 years old. I asked him about the Olympics and if they would have any effect on Kawauchi, because, it's not really that far from Naraha. And he said that only large Tokyo construction companies were used and local firms were not even used. He said that local businesses were not even used to construct things for local projects, something about building a school or whatever. Local construction companies weren't used. They were all big companies from outside the area. We went into the convenience store and they had this big display rack of PR materials for the town. They had ads for restaurants, hotels, jobs, and there was some really slick material trying to recruit new residents to live in the town, and there was a really fancy tourism guide. I found the recruitment guide to be really shocking. As a mom of a first-year college student, I'm fresh off of a full year of constant, expensive college catalogs in the mail. And this advertisement for new residents in that little teeny tiny town looked just like a college recruitment catalog. On the cover is a cute, modern-looking family with an adorable baby and a preschool-age daughter. The inside cover is a flowing stream with cherry trees in bloom. And there's more flowing streams and young families and babies throughout the rest of the catalog. There's interviews with cool residents like a gallery owner and a sommelier who's starting a vineyard. And there's ads for job hunters and information about housing and activities. There's really so much hope on offer. You can have all of this in a town that is within the original 20-kilometer exclusion zone. A town where 80% of the original residents have elected not to return.
Beverly Findlay-Kaneko, sharing her observations from a recent trip through Fukushima Prefecture. We'll have part 2 of this interview in the coming weeks, when Beverly relates what she learned about pro-nuclear brainwashing, thyroid cancer rates, and dramatic changes in Tomioka, Aizu, and Namie, where she comes within visual distance of Fukushima Daiichi itself. Understated truth and not to be missed. Activist shout-outs! On Friday, November 22nd, if you're in New York, there is going to be a vigil held in front of the Japanese consulate in New York City between 11 a.m. and 1 p.m. Eastern Time. A request for your participation comes from Mari Inoue, who spoke so movingly on Nuclear Hotseat number 435 from October 22nd this year on the Citizens Radiation Data Map of Fukushima, which revealed dangers throughout Japan that the Japanese government would prefer you not know about. Join her if you can. And this urgent call out from multiple national nuclear groups. If you are in the U.S., we need you to call your House representative in Congress and tell them in no uncertain terms, vote no on H.R. 2699, the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act of 2019. Here's why. The bill would authorize the U.S. Department of Energy to take ownership of commercial irradiated nuclear fuel, even at a so-called interim site. This is currently prohibited by the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982. The reason for this wise precaution and prohibition is that a consolidated interim storage facility away from a nuclear reactor and delinked from a permanent repository runs a very high risk of becoming de facto permanent surface storage or a parking lot dump. This could lead to catastrophic releases of hazardous radioactivity into the environment over a long enough period of time, if and when the containers fail, are not maintained, not replaced, and leak their forever deadly contents. Note that irradiated nuclear fuel is hazardous for 1 million years. So the time is right now. As we are recording this, it is supposed to be voted on in committee in the House. Call your House representative and tell them in no uncertain terms, no, on H.R. 2699. This has been Nuclear Hot Seat for Tuesday, November 19, 2019. Material for this week's show has been researched and compiled from nuclear-news.net, deunrenard.wordpress.com, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, or ICAN, Nuclear Education and Information Service, LATimes.com, Physicians for Social Responsibility Los Angeles, KNBC Los Angeles, Cape Cod Times, thebulletin.org, forconstructionpros.com, MSN.com, TaipeiTimes.com, JapanTimes.co.jp, Asia.nikkei.com, KoreaTimes.co.kr, UnseenJapan.com, Express.co.uk, and the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. If you don't want to miss a single episode of Nuclear Hot Seat, go to our website, nuclearhotseat.com, scroll down to the yellow box, and sign up with your first name and email address to receive 1 email a week, which gives you the link to the current episode. We're also available on all the major podcast platforms, so you can subscribe there as well. If you have a story lead, a hot tip, or a suggestion of someone to interview, send an email to info@nuclearhotseat.com. And if you appreciate weekly verifiable news updates about nuclear issues around the world, take a moment to send a donation of any size to nuclearhotseat.com. We are always truly grateful for your support. This episode of Nuclear Hot Seat is copyright 2019, Libby Halevi and Hardestry Communications. All rights reserved, but fair use allowed, as long as proper attribution is provided. This is Libby Halevi of Hardestry Communications, the heart of the art of communicating, reminding you that we can always come up with the date that a nuclear emergency begins, but we can never come up with a date that it's over, because once it starts, it's never over. There you go. You have just had your nuclear wake-up call. So don't go back to sleep, because we are all in the nuclear hot seat.
Nuclear hot seat. What are those people thinking? Nuclear hot seat. What have those boys been drinking? Nuclear hot seat. The corium is sinking. Our time to act is shrinking, but our activists are linking. Nuclear hot seat. It's the bomb.